Hello, and welcome to the GTRIP Research Methods for Library and Information Professional Series. My name is Emily Vardell, and I'm a doctoral student and teaching fellow in the School of Information and Library Science at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. This module is about semi-structured interviews. Semi-structured interviews are a qualitative research method designed to capture a well-rounded picture of an individual's experience. As Doody and Noonan write, interviews are particularly useful in uncovering the story behind a participant's experiences. Interviews allow researchers to gain insight and context and provide interviewees with a platform for describing their unique experiences. The back and forth of a natural conversation is mirrored in interviews, allowing researchers to ask more complex questions and participants to seek clarification and shed light on previously unanticipated areas. Because the interviewer is interested in understanding a respondent's experience as closely as possible, interviewees play a strong role in the course that an interview takes. Jonathan Smith explains that in this relationship, the respondent can be perceived as the expert on the subject and should therefore be allowed maximum opportunity to tell his or her own story. The flexibility of an interview is often described through its structure. The three most commonly discussed interview techniques are structured, semi-structured, and unstructured. Structured interviews are very similar to questionnaires and surveys in that they feature a list of previously designed questions that the interviewer uses with an interviewee. A semi-structured interview, however, may include a list of questions, and it may also include probes for further information. An interviewer using a semi-structured interview protocol is often asking questions that may or may not be included on the pre-written list of questions. An unstructured conversation would not have any kind of script or design ahead of time. This slide further explores the distinction between semi-structured and structured interviews by looking at their advantages and disadvantages. As you can see from the table, semi-structured interviews are more flexible, enable discussion, and produce richer responses. However, investigators using semi-structured interviews have less control over the conversation, and the results may be more difficult to analyze. For example, you may end up asking different questions to different respondents, which may make comparisons more difficult. Structured interviews, on the other hand, are faster to conduct and allow the researcher to have more control. Because of this, they are more reliable, as you have asked the same questions of all participants, and may be a better choice when working with participants with special needs. However, structured interviews are limiting in that a researcher may not have thought ahead of time of all of the important questions, and so the data may not be as rich or go into the needed detail. We will talk more about interview guides on the next slide. In semi-structured interviews, the interview guide, also called the interview schedule or interview protocol, includes an outline of topics to be covered with suggested questions. The level of predetermined structure and questions will depend on the particular study at hand. The interview guide may be very specific with carefully worded questions, or it may be a list of topics to be covered. A researcher should consider the research question, the tentative conceptual model underlying the research, and the population of interest when developing a well-constructed interview guide. Doody and Noonan have very helpful guidelines for developing an interview guide. They write that developing an interview guide requires planning for difficulties that may arise, including the phrasing of complex questions and discussions of sensitive topics. It is imperative that a researcher consider difficulties in advance that they may face, particularly question wording and how to handle sensitive areas. To avoid biasing responses and to maximize the quality of the information collection, Smith recommends questions that are neutral, avoid jargon, and are open-ended. In addition, structuring questions through careful consideration of the concept of time may help participants frame their responses and increase the accuracy of the information that's collected. Duty and Noonan recommend asking questions about the participant's current situation before questions about the past or future to help the participant to engage more easily with the questions. Furthermore, Alfred Kinsey, one of the first researchers to use semi-structured interviews, states that while there may be a basic minimum of material that is covered on each history, the interviewer should not hesitate to secure additional data on special situations that are outside of the routine. This openness to additional topics is another aspect that distinguishes semi-structured interviewing techniques from structured interviewing techniques. Being open to areas that you did not expect can help shed light on topics about which the interviewees are the experts. It is also important to fit the interview guide to the vocabulary, educational background, and understanding of each participant. This responsiveness to cultural differences is a particular feature of semi-structured interviews and distinguishes them as an effective tool in many unique research areas. Many researchers recommend memorizing your interview guide in advance, as it may be distracting to participants if you frequently refer to the guide during the interview. If you know your guide by memory, you will be able to be more flexible with how the interview flows. If a respondent is hesitant to share, Jonathan Smith recommends that interviewers have more specific level questions or probes on hand. The use of probes will be discussed further in the next section. In addition to identifying questions, a semi-structured interview guide should include some probes designed to encourage participants to share further information or to build trust through the use of the researcher's active listening skills. These probes are designed to encourage participants to think more deeply about the questions being asked. While they may not be necessary with all participants, probes may be invaluable with participants who are less likely to elaborate or need further information about the context. The first probe listed on this chart, the silent probe, may be the most difficult for an interviewer to master, as it requires remaining silent and waiting for the participant to continue. This technique may be particularly important with cultures where silence is expected and appropriate. The echo probe is particularly useful when a participant is recounting stories. With this probe, you would repeat the shared information back to the participant. The verbal agreement probe, also called the probe, is used to encourage an informant to continue and is an example of a neutral probe. The tell me more probe is the most commonly used probe, but you have to be careful not to overuse it, as interviewees may become sensitive to hearing it multiple times. Varying the different probes is strongly recommended. The longer questions probe suggests to participants that their responses should also be long. The last two probes identified by Bernard are a little more difficult to manage. The leading probe is actually often considered bad practice in semi-structured interviews. You have to be careful not to put too much of your own interpretation into the question, but instead leave the question open so that the participant can share his or her own experiences. However, sometimes leading questions are necessary to test an interviewer's knowledge or understanding with participants. If a leading question clearly indicates an interviewer is misunderstanding a concept, an interviewee can chime in and redirect the interviewer. The baiting probe is when the interviewer acts as if she already knows something to get people to open up. This technique is often used by journalists and can be effective in obtaining trust as well as thought-provoking responses. Now that you have your interview guide and probes ready, you will want to identify good informants. A good informant or participant is someone who is knowledgeable about the topic you are interested in. They are seen as an expert because of their involvement in particular experiences. They should also be willing to talk. In a semi-structured interview, the interviewee plays a large role in dictating the course of the interview. The interviewer should use the interview schedule to suggest the general area of interest and to provide probes or cues when the participant has difficulties. But ultimately, the participant should have a strong role in how the interview proceeds. In reaction to the responsiveness of an interviewee, an interviewer must be adept at knowing how to shape the interview. For example, when to follow leads and when to stick to the interview guide. Because effective interviewing has so many nuances, It has been likened to an art form and requires a combination of the right learned skills and the right personality and temperament. Interviewers must also be mindful of their nonverbal actions. Duty and Noonan highlight that the researcher needs to show empathy, listen actively, and maintain eye contact. It is important that he or she does not exhibit strong reactions and maintains a neutral demeanor, as participants will not want to say things that they feel the researcher may disagree with. An interviewer should also be careful to avoid bias through how they act. The interviewer should establish a rapport with the respondent and work to minimize any influence he or she might play in the responses they collect. Although it is tempting to begin with generalizations of the data, Jonathan Smith encourages researchers to look in detail at one transcript before moving on to the others. This technique requires researchers to start with the particulars or the details and then work up to generalizations. In step 1, you should make notes in the margins of your interview transcripts. These notations can include summarizations, connections with other content, or preliminary interpretations. Then you can use the other margin to document concepts that you see emerging from the data. It is best to use keywords, preferably drawn from the words of the interviewers themselves, to identify common experiences or concepts. Then on a separate sheet, you should list the emerging theme and look for connections between them. The theme should cluster around larger topics. Stepping back from the data and using theory to enable interpretation may help with the identification of larger trends. In step 4, you will want to produce a master list of themes in an order that makes sense for the topic. You may want to include sub-themes sorted under the relevant master theme. Lastly, you will add identifiers of instances. This means you will go back to your transcripts and find where the participants talked about the themes you discovered. This stage may require copying and pasting participants' quotes to illustrate particular concepts. Semi-structured interviews can be analyzed on a few different levels, including classification to present a range of views, detailing of particular themes, and/or the life history of a participant presented as a narrative. Thank you for watching the GTRIP Research Methods for Library and Information Professionals series module on semi-structured interviews. You can find more information on using semi-structured interviews in the background and supplemental reading document. Good luck with your research.